And I think that it's really telling that it's a beautiful Sunday, and we have over around 80 people that registered for this webinar that was just announced last week that want some help and guidance with Component 4, the newest of the national board components on the effective and reflective practitioner. Before we get started, I want to make sure that we go over a couple of some technical guidance while we're in Zoom. Because we have so many people who might be joining the call, please don't use your camera. So if you've got your camera on, if you don't mind to stop your video, that will help us some with the bandwidth. And if you don't know where to find that, I can also control that on my end, because that helps us to run the meeting a little smoother when we have meetings this large. Please mute your audio when you're not speaking, because we get a lot of feedback if people are not muted. Holly and I are going to be leading this webinar and doing most of the talking, but feel free to grab the microphone and talk if you have questions at any time, or the chat box might be an easier place to do some of that. And to find your chat box, if you're not sure where that is, you should see a bar that has things like mute, start video. It would give you the option for a screen share, and it also some other controls. You might have a box that says chat, or you might have something that says more and has 3 dots. And if you hover on the more, you'll see chat as one of the options there, if it's not automatically on your screen. You can also look at your, when you're looking at yourself, if you see yourself in the participant list, and you can control things like unmute and mute on your participant screen where you see yourself, and also your camera and things too. It's easier if you then open your chat box and leave it open so that you can see conversation that's going on there. As we get a lot of questions on the webinar, in order to try to stay on topic, we're going to be moving those, Holly and I are going to be moving those questions into a Google Doc that we're going to be working on behind the scenes, and organize that to go over questions at the end that haven't already been addressed, so that we make sure that we have those. So if you have a question, you don't have to wait to ask it. It's not going to interrupt our flow, and we'll make sure that way we've captured it, and we'll make sure to cover those questions, either as they come in if it fits with what we're talking about, or at the end if they're pretty specific. And if you see someone else that's in the meeting that you work with or have questions for and want to have a private conversation, you can direct chat questions. If you click on the chat box where it says everyone, you can also choose a specific participant, or if you just want to ask a question to me or Holly and not necessarily to the whole group, you can put questions in there that not everyone will see. And so you can manage that, and that's private. I can't, as the leader, I only see chats if I'm included. And just reach out if you need any help with anything. Any other questions on the technical aspect of the meeting? Okay. All right. All right, Holly, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Holly Bloodworth. I'm a teacher at Murray Elementary School in Murray, Kentucky. It's the far western part of the state. I am the president of the NBCT Network for Kentucky, and look forward to all of you joining our network very soon. We are a new network, so we're still in the process of forming and all of that, but we have our board of directors in place. We have committees forming, and candidate support and advocacy and all kinds of things are part of our mission. So we are looking forward to having you all join us in that network. I work with Suzanne with the NT3 grant, and looking forward to helping you all today. I guess I should say I'm an early childhood generalist. I certified a long time ago, and I am renewed, so I'm good through 2022, I think. So I do candidate support here in Western Kentucky, and I'm happy to be here today.
Thanks, Holly. And I just wanted to mention, when Holly talked about the National Board Network, that that group is really new. There will be an opportunity if you want to join that network as a candidate. You don't have to be board certified to join that network. It's just that we're honestly so new that we haven't quite figured out how to accept money yet for membership, and that we still have to create a bank account and things. So I know that Holly will be reaching out to you with more information about that opportunity as that group works out some of those details. My name is Suzanne Farmer. I board certified as an early childhood generalist in 2004, and I have also renewed. So I'm good through 2024. And I certified while I was teaching preschool and renewed it while I was a math interventionist. I'm currently on leave from my school district, which is the Danville Independent Schools, to work on a grant that Holly talked about called the Network to Transform Teaching, which is a grant that's funded through the U.S. Department of Education through the National Board. So I work a lot with the National Board, and our state agencies that are partners on that work are the Kentucky Department of Education, the Kentucky Education Association, and the Education Professional Standards Board. All right, and even though Holly and I do a lot of candidate support, and I even work closely with the National Board on the grant, and so does Holly, we wanted to make a disclaimer that we cannot always be sure that we're answering questions that just be careful about if you have specific questions and you want to know if something is allowable or non-allowable. And if we're not sure, the definitive answer needs to come from 1-800-22-TEACH, or you can email the MBPTS candidate support at pearson.com. A lot of the technical answers are in the directions for component 4, but also in the guide to National Board Certification and in the general board portfolio directions. So if we can't find the specific answer or feel like you need to reach out, the best thing to do is to always double check, because we just want to make sure that we're not giving anyone incorrect information for some really specific questions.
And don't hesitate to reach out to them. They're really good to get back with your questions. And if you email, just don't wait till the last minute to ask your questions. They'll get back to you, and then you even have it, in writing. So don't hesitate to reach out to them. That's what they're there for.
All right. So some norms before we get started. We, in our work with National Board, work with, we use these norms that are organized into buckets of ideas. Equity, service, community, growth, results, reflect, and bringing levity. So we constantly also try to have fun with our work. But Holly and I were thinking that given the format of this call, and that it's that we have a large group and it's virtual, that it would be important to really pay attention to equity. We know that a lot of you are going to have some pretty specific questions and some pretty specific scenarios, but with 80 people registered, we might not be able to get to all of your specific questions. So thinking about that, go ahead and put them in the chat box if you have them, and we'll deal with them the best we can. We are also going to have a follow-up survey where if your questions are not answered, there will be an opportunity for you to get to ask those questions in a survey, and then Holly's going to work to follow up with people as soon as possible this week with needs that might not have been addressed on the call or things that you might need as next steps. And we can build those resources and plan for follow-up that way too. And then because we know that you all have a lot of work to get accomplished, just really making sure that you think about what's going to be most helpful for you and really trying to stay results focused. There, any other comments or questions on the norms?
On the bring levity, I'm not sure how much of a good time we're going to have on here today, but do know that we want to help you, and I will be reaching out to you with individual questions that we don't answer. So don't feel like it has to be over here.
It's true, Holly. I wish we could. I wish we could say this is going to be loads of fun. All right, so we're going to ask you to work in the chat box for a minute. One of the things about this component that's important to know is in my initial conversations with National Board, when this component was still a pilot component, I asked some questions about the changes and what to expect. And Kristen Hamilton, who was involved with rewriting Component 4 at the National Board, said that the most important thing to keep in mind about this component is that the internal name for it, for the people that created this, who, by the way, were board-certified teachers. So board-certified teachers create these assessments and score the assessments, that those teachers named this component knowing your students. And I think that's the most important big idea to keep at the front of your mind. So thought give you all a minute in the chat box to type in what you do to know your students. Some really great ideas in the chat box that if you, I think, really there's some trends about talking with parents, talking with the kids, eating with kids, surveys, conferences. observations, interactions. Really like some of the emphasis on just playing together and those relaxing, unstructured times to get to know your kids better.
Yeah, I love the fact that you're thinking beyond. I mean, I think looking at test data and assessments, those kinds of things are really valuable too, and definitely a part of it. I'm glad you're thinking beyond those kinds of things too. I mean, even just valuing those conversations, I think that's great.
Absolutely. And if there's people on the phone that are having a hard time seeing the chat box, just some really some evaluations, IEPs, talking to previous teachers, parents, guardians, eating lunch, conferencing, surveys, mentoring, lots and lots of evaluative and assessment information, but also really really great ideas about just knowing their interests and playing games, and some conversation around home visits, and going to other school events and eating lunch together, and those kind of things too. So I would absolutely agree that home visits can be really, really rich way to know your students too. So these are, when you think about the ways that you know your students, these are all things that you can include in your commentary. So don't feel like you have to only rely on assessment data to know your students, or I should say formal assessment data. All right, and we're going to try a poll here. So I'm going to start a poll that you should see on your screen now. And if you can't see it on your screen, don't worry about it. You can just pick one of these numbers and put it in the chat box if it's not coming up on your screen, about where you are in the process right now. All right, I'm going to end the polling. We've got most people have voted or have put something in the chat box. So you'll see these results. You should see them on your screen. We have a few that are in the chat box that have also chosen 3, and 3 is the one that is showing up as the one that has the most results, which would have even more. Amanda's got a question in the chat box. So if there's people that want to answer her, that's a super good question, and we can also think about that. I know Holly is sort of in that position this year. So most of you are analyzing your assessments, determining your need, and designing your unit of study right now. Then we have a few people that are actually implementing their unit or refining and starting to write and edit their components. I guess this is good news that there's no one on the call that's really thinking about that they might get started. We know that this information will be helpful for people that that might be getting started in the future, but they can listen to the recording, and we can spend this time really helping those that are on at a point with this to really dig in. And a few people that are really just thinking about how to get started. So that helps us to know you so that we can plan our instruction more effectively. So thank you. Right, and your instructions for component 4, there are some major headings that are helpful for those of you that are new to the component, but it might also be helpful to review for those of you that are in the middle of planning your instruction or refining and writing. So the very first page after your component directions, there's a table of contents, but then there's this overview. And the overview really gives you the big idea of what you have to provide for your for component 4. And these overviews look the same for all of the different component areas, really. Then it should probably be on the back of the next page where there's a list of the standards that this component is assessing. Now, these are your certificate area standards that if you don't already have them printed, you need to print them and you need to read them. And we'll talk a little bit more about those standards in a minute, but these are the ones that this standard has a tight connection with and that you have to demonstrate and there are expectations in the scoring rubric for this specific component. Then it's probably going to be in a couple of pages. On mine, on page 4, I see a subheading that says, what do I need to do? And it bullets in this entry, and it will talk about like 4 things that you have to do. Describe and build a profile of a group of students, demonstrate that the assessment choices you make, and it lists what you have to do. Then, what do I need to submit? This is another really helpful list of exactly what you have to submit for this component. And then skipping a few pages, the other really big helpful idea to consider is on mine, starting on page 11, everything that's in italics are questions that you have to answer. So mine is on 11 and 12. There's italicized questions, and those are things that you need to answer. And we have a writing webinar that's scheduled in a couple of months, but something that can be really helpful in terms of when you decide that you're ready to write is to actually, within each section, to have those italicized questions and to keep those in there until you're at the end when you decide to take those questions out, so that anyone who's reading your entry and giving you feedback knows exactly what questions you're expected to answer and can have those questions in there as they're giving you feedback on your component. So we just wanted to give a brief overview. Holly, did you have anything to add on this?
Oh my. No, that sounds good. And I think it's nice to kind of have that just overview. And I do really love the idea of embedding your questions into your narrative as you're answering them, just so you be sure and answer the questions. You'd be really surprised, because I read a lot of people's things, how many people don't answer the questions. So just make sure that you're addressing every question that it lists, where it tells you what to say, like it tells you the questions. Make sure you actually answer every one of them.
And it's great to have them in there in the italics to make sure that that you don't forget that those are the things that you need to answer. But then
take them out.
Yes, make sure you take them out. But then some people will even put stems in to say, like, for the first question, like, the sources for the information that were gathered were blah, 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 blah. Just like we tell our students, so that you're sure that you do have those answers in there. So that is a strategy you can do, but you don't have to.
Right. But you do need to answer every question.
Right. And if you feel like the questions are repetitive, then you probably need to read them again, because they're not going to be asking you the same thing more than once. And really thinking about this time when they're asking me the question, it's at a different point in the instruction, or it's focused on knowledge of students and not on the assessment. So just really thinking about the nuances between the questions, because you shouldn't have to repeat yourself. So just answer the ones they're asking you when they ask them of you. Okay, I saw this graphic actually the other day from a group in New York that was doing some candidate support, and I thought it was really helpful to consider how a student learning need, a professional learning need, and a professional learning community need could overlap. And there's multiple ways, of course, where you might have your student need overlapping with your professional learning need, and a student need overlapping with your professional learning community need. You might have all three of those things overlapping. And really where those three things overlap, where the star is the sweet spot. So this is really, hold on, just copying some questions again. So, so looking at starting with knowing your students, and then thinking about, when I know my students, what are they telling me, or what is a group of students telling me that they need? And how does that then inform what I need to do to collaborate, lead, and learn? And then making sure that that what I do is impacting students. And it's impacting what they know, not necessarily looking just at achievement, but really looking at what are these students learning or not learning, and how do I know if I'm impacting them or not. So the assessment that you're going to consider, this is something that came straight out of a webinar that Holly and I were on the other day with the National Board for Component for Support, and they really emphasized that assessment was not just the level of achievement, but really thinking more broadly around assessment to really be focused on learning. Okay, so when you consider these big ideas and you look at our 5 core propositions, which are in everyone's standards, and we're also in the document that we had linked to for the What Teachers Should Know and Be Able to Do book. For these 5 propositions, they link really nicely with each of these big ideas. So the student learning need is most tightly connected with core proposition 1, which is teachers are committed to students and their learning. The professional learning need is linked really tightly with core proposition 4. Teachers think systematically about their practice and learn from experience. And then the professional learning community need with core proposition 5, teachers are members of learning communities. And we're going to dig a little more into the core propositions in a sec. So the Green Book, or this What Teachers Should Know and Be Able to Do, was just recently released late this winter, and is a new version of the explication of the 5 core propositions that the preface has some interesting history about these 5 core propositions and about National Board. And the original explication of the 5 core propositions, the What Teachers Should Know and Be Able to Do, was really more of was just a Word document that was created to explain the 5 core propositions back in the 1980s, before there were even any teachers who were board certified. And this was recently rewritten and revised by board certified teachers to have more specific language and more current language to really address how society and education have changed since the 1980s. So there is some really helpful language in here. Of course, your standards are going to give you very specific language for your certificate and developmental area. But this explication of the 5 core propositions can give us some nice language, that relate to all teachers around some of these ideas. And one of them that really feels like a nice fit is when they're asking us to know our students. There are several pages that are devoted to core proposition 1, but there's also a subheading on page 12, teachers recognize individual differences in their students and adjust their practice accordingly. And that's just about a page and a half of text. And wondering if you all, that was one of the documents that we'd ask you to be able to have handy. If you want to look at that document in that section and see if there are sentences or phrases or ideas that really jump out to you about some of the expectations for teachers about addressing individual needs and understanding differences. You can put those in the chat box or grab the microphone. All right, I love the examples that that Cindy's got in the chat box. Oh, I like this idea too from, I don't know if it's K-E Sloan, about different ways that we address the needs of these kids. I like that this section really calls out how hard this can be, and specifically on page 14, such an extensive evaluation represents no easy feat. Really talking about how we study our kids and all of the different ways that we can get to know them. So these are some aspects that if you have not already included them in your conversations about your students and the ways that you give that assessment data, these are things that they are, this is what they're talking about when you consider what you know about your students. So including things around personality, including things around their difference in home life, including things around their interest and abilities, and even talks about their beliefs, their thoughts. So really considering those things as part of this profile of your students and part of how you're going to address that need. So I really wanted to make sure that you all knew about this resource because it's brand new and I feel that it's kind of buried at this point in the National Board website. National Board is working to try to revise the website to make it, now that the new version is completely rolled out, to make it a lot more user-friendly and make these resources more accessible. So I have some similar sections. We don't have to go through each one, but I also think it's important to look at. I know that this section relies very heavily on assessment, and in Core Proposition 3 on page 27 of this book, from page 27 to 29, it talks about teachers regularly assess student progress. And in this section, it talks about different types of assessment and ways to assess your students. So if you have not looked at this before, going back and looking at this section, you may want to flag it or make a note that this is a section that you may want to go back and read again if you've already read it, or to look at this and to take some notes about what you're already doing, or thinking about what you could still improve or do differently. I really like on page 28, it says at the top, by adding to their repertoire of assessment methods and by monitoring student progress regularly, accomplished teachers provide students, families, caregivers, and themselves with constructive feedback. There's a whole lot in here that could be dissected to really help with your growth in this component.
Yeah, you know, Suzanne, I think on page 28 also it goes on to say something about how the judgments and of individual students, it's all interconnected, but the dynamic conveys some teaching's essential tensions. It's that tension between instructing individual students and guiding the development of groups. And I think component 4 is really hitting at how we do that as teachers. You know, that's why you create this group profile, is because, you know, the component 2 really emphasizes working with individual students. And this component is really hitting more at how you deal with that tension of, you know, hitting individual needs, but also the tension of guiding a whole group also. So I think I think this is a really good thing to read to kind of help get your mind around what component 4 is really targeting.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up that section because that does get at, I think, in many ways, one of the toughest parts about this component is being able to, and we'll talk about this as we talk about the student group, but that National Board does require that you consider, if you're a classroom teacher, that you have to consider your whole class, but then also really looking at the needs of a group within that class and how do you balance that. So thanks for calling out that part of it. There's one more section that I think is really helpful, and that's actually the entire section on Core Proposition 5, because this component does rely really heavily on being a part of a learning community, which these sections within pages 35 through 39 are teachers collaborate with other professionals to improve school effectiveness. And teachers work collaboratively with families, which is something that every one of you is really addressing in our chat box, and that teachers work collaboratively with the community. And those ideas should sound very familiar to what you need to demonstrate within this component. Holly, was there anything you want to add on that one?
No, not really. I think we'll be talking about this later, but I just think this is a really great new resource that has been written since kind of in light of the new components as they're written. So I think this is a really good thing to read, just because I think it kind of, you can see where the components are coming from as you read this document, because it's been written in the same time period.
Absolutely. Right. I think that the revisions to this are really nice. And while what I like about this document as well is that so often we get so caught up in our specific standard area and developmental area that we forget about some of these foundational tenets that apply to all good teaching for every teacher. So I recommend really dissecting this and not necessarily limiting your read to those sections, but those sections felt especially pertinent for this focus on component 4. And all right. Speaking of your specific standards, when we talked about the nuts and bolts, the standards were a big part of, they're right after your overview. I'm looking at one certificate area that has them listed on page 2. They should be on page 2 for most people. So when you're looking at your portfolio and it lists the standard number and then the title of those standards that your portfolio would be expected to demonstrate. So this is what's going to be on your scoring rubric. So this is like, keeping the end in mind from the beginning. We tell our students, like, what is it that you have to show? What is it that you're expecting to know? What's our learning target? These are your learning targets. These are the things that you have to demonstrate in your writing. So what's a little difficult about listing these is that if you're not aware, every single standard, every single certificate area, those standards are not boilerplate. So they have different names and different content. Some of them have 11 standards, some have 9 or 10. So we don't even have the same number of standards within each certificate area, which makes a common conversation around the standards a little tricky. However, you should have some of these big ideas should be a part of the list of the titles of the standards that are on your list. So knowing your students, something around the idea of diversity or equity, planning your instruction or making decisions, maybe responsive instruction. There's lots of different titles that could match that one. Something about partnerships or collaboration or outreach. Also something about leadership or professionalism or advocacy. And then every standard has one that may not be called reflective practice, but every certificate area has something about reflection as a standard too. So if there's anything that you wanted to call out that feels different about yours within your standards that you're expected to demonstrate, feel free to grab the mic or put that in the chat box. But really thinking about when we look at these big ideas with this standard, it makes a lot of sense that we would have knowledge of students, because remember, the in-house name for this certificate is knowing your kids. So everyone should have something that would hit at that, even if that's not the title of your standard. This idea of diversity and equity and addressing these individual needs was very much what we were looking at within the Green Book for knowing your students for core proposition 1. So that's where we're going to hit that conversation around addressing diversity and equity. And that's also a subsection of the Green Book under Core Prop 1. Making your instructional decisions obviously is connected to knowing your students and assessment, but that's where if in this component, we're expected to make decisions based on what we know about our kids, gathering lots of information, some of that being formal assessment and some of that being through conversations with parents and other colleagues and our observations. And so the idea that we know what they need and then we can develop instruction for them, whether it's the whole group or a small group or an individual. Then obviously with every one of these, we have to demonstrate some partnership and also some leadership. That's our professional growth and our professional need. And then reflection being a huge piece of this so that we can constantly be improving, thinking about our next steps. Other comments or questions on that part of it? Or feeling that, do you see the tight connection with what you're expected to demonstrate in your standards and the component for your certificate area? I know many of you may have been like at a jump start or worked with a mentor who has suggested some advice on reading your standards. If you haven't already read your standards and taken notes while you're reading them, I recommend reading your standards with some highlighters or markers, some colored markers, and a pen or pencil. And as you're reading your standards, highlighting maybe in pink things that you feel like you're not doing well and you really need to tackle, that you could do better. Yellow, maybe things that you feel like you do it pretty well, but you're struggling to come up with evidence of how you know you do that. Green, things that you feel like you do that very well and you have some examples of knowing how you do that well and you can cite some evidence like, I do home visits, or I make sure that I plan writing prompts based on what their interests are. So, giving those examples and going ahead and writing them in your margins. And maybe blue, if it's something that, I want to know more about this and I have an idea, like I know that Amanda does this really well. So I'm going to go and talk to Amanda, or I'm going to go to her classroom and see and ask her questions about it. Or I have this really great article I've been meaning to read. And that's where, I know I need to read that. And that's a reminder that I should do that. So everything that you're writing in those margins, that's really going to be your evidence that you're going to want to cite when you're writing about this component. And those colors are going to remind you this is your own personal professional growth that's driven by your classroom and your kids. Some teachers do this every year, even after they certify, just as a reminder of how they can continually improve, or how this can be, how this can drive their professional growth every year.
For me, Suzanne, and everyone, I don't think we can emphasize enough that the standards are kind of the heart of this. Through your writing, you will be showing, you'll be proving that you meet these standards. That's how when you become certified, that's kind of what they're saying is they feel like you have shown enough evidence to prove that you meet the standards. So I remember when I went through the process, I had a couple of copies that I would keep one in my car. And if I was waiting somewhere, I would just kind of be reading through them. So they just became kind of internalized, so that when I would be writing or those kinds of things, it would just kind of come out. So I agree with Suzanne so much that making notes in the margins of the things that you do that demonstrate those standards, it's really great. And just keep looking at them. I mean, to me, those are just a real core of this component.
Right. And also, when it's really helpful, even if you've read them a while back, and maybe this is your third year as a candidate and you read them your first year, if you haven't reread them in a while, it would be important to look at them again with some fresh eyes, because you're going to notice some different things you're going to be changed as a teacher, and you're going to notice some new things and some new ideas, some new evidence that you're doing now, and encourage you to reread them.
And in light of this component,
absolutely.
This component. Mm-hmm.
And when you're struggling to write, sometimes it's really hard to get started when you're looking at a blank page. Look at the language in these standards. What is it that they're saying? How are they talking about their practice? And really looking to that language to inspire your writing. I think that often when people think about reading standards, as teachers, it's not always standards that are going to be inspirational. They're standards that are maybe evaluative of what we're expected to demonstrate as teachers in terms of content. And I find these standards to be very different. These standards remind me why I teach. These standards are written specifically for teachers that teach the things I teach. And since I've been in this position, I've read some different, when I certified, I only read my standards, which were the early childhood standards. But since I've been in this position and worked with some teachers in other content areas, I have read other standards. And it's really interesting the way, because these are written by teachers that teach in those content areas, there's some similarities across all of them. But they're written very specifically for the teachers of those standards. So when I was reading the reflection standard for high school science teachers, I thought it was really interesting that there was this really strong analogy to the scientific process, that this whole idea of inquiry applied to that teacher's instruction too. And those types of analogies and examples are all over these standards. So read them again. All right, Holly, you want to talk about this great article?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. I was just chatting away. This is really a good article. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it or not, but if you have not, print it out. It was attached in the invitation that Suzanne sent. And for me and this component, it really seemed to validate what I was thinking the component was hitting at in a way that just helped me understand it a little bit better. So if you have not read this, please do, because I think it will help you. Part of this component deals with assessments. And you have a standard that deals somewhere, one of your standards will deal with assessment, and it is one of the standards that's probably featured for you in this component. So read through that also. I would say read through the standard about assessment and then read this article and see how they jive. When you look at this article, it talks about particularly about the formative assessment component of this. So let's just chat for a moment. I'd like to hear some of your voices. What do you see as the difference between formative assessment and summative assessment? So you can either put something in the chat box, or I wouldn't mind hearing you say something. So if you would like to talk, just unmute and we'll do that. The difference between formative and summative. All right, we're getting some good things in the chat box about formative assessments. And I mean, everything that you're saying is right in line with my thinking also. Formative assessments do help drive your instruction, and they can look a lot of different ways. They don't even have to be paper pencil. It can be conversation, those kinds of things. In the article, it lists some components of formative assessment, and one of those was, you know, the students need to have a clear picture of what their learning target is. Then it needs to involve feedback. It might be feedback from you, it might be feedback from peers, but it's not like a grade. Somebody mentioned it's not really graded. So I think formative assessment it's not like you missed 3 on this, but it's really more feedback in terms of helping students understand, you know, what they're not understanding or how to move themselves in the direction of the learning target. So it can be from peers, it can be from you. Students engage in self-assessment, and I know the component talks about self-assessment. So that was something that this article really helped me clarify a little bit in my own mind, was the whole self-assessment part that it mentioned, that it talks about in the component. So students engaging in self-assessment is talked about in the article. And then that whole process of then the students figuring out what their steps are, their next steps in the learning cycle. So what do they need to do next? Now they know this, so what is next? Are there we may be getting a few questions. Let's see. It talks about using some student self-assessment. A rubric is, I think, a really great tool to use for self-assessment. If, you know, the students need to have a clear understanding of what the target is, and maybe even be involved in helping create that rubric possibly, but then seeing how they compare to that is very valuable and would be a self-assessment. Having models of work for them and seeing how they compare to different models is also a good way for students to self-assess. My students use a rubric to self-assess. They also conference with me. Yes, is it okay to include an example of one rubric and then a self-reflection on another? Yeah, I think so. I think you would like an example of them using the rubric and then marking like where they are on that rubric. And then I think what you would need for that reflection would be kind of a dictation of what was said, like what you said, what they said, that kind of thing. Or just, I don't know if that's what you mean, or a self-reflection on another. I'm not sure what, Elizabeth Nichols, what you mean on that. But yes, I think you definitely can use different kinds of self-assessments, yes. Not sure what the question means exactly. I need to look back in the directions, but I think it says if it's a conference, then you need like you need to type it up, like what you said, what they said, that kind of thing. Dictation.
Right. The example on the certificate area I'm looking at, this is in the section. Okay, so on the section that would be, there's like selecting your groups of students, knowledge of students, and then there's generation and use of assessment data. And on mine, this actually falls under, it's on page 8. And it talks about in each file with the completed assessment materials form, include the following. And it has the assessment, and then data or the results. And then the third bullet on mine says, for the formative assessment only, examples of 3 students' use of self-assessment as part of the assessment process. And it has, for example, student self-evaluation using a rubric or checklist. And then the other example on my certificate area that I'm looking at says transcript of a conversation between students or between a student and the educator. So you could use a rubric with one student or a checklist with another student or a transcript with another student. These do not have to be the same. Given that we know that different kids are going to need different things. Or perhaps it could be something that because of the developmental age or level of your students, you have to really modify some of this. So I did some self-assessment when I certified as a preschool teacher. Self-assessment was not a requirement because we didn't have, the component didn't look like this at that time. But one of the things, for example, that I did with some of my students was I had them look at writing samples since they were 2, 3, 4, and 5 years old. They looked at writing samples and kind of considered some and pictures and looked at like, well, mine kind of looks a lot like this. And this is why it looks like this is what I know I'm able to do. And when I look at this next one, this is how it looks different. And so these are things I need to kind of work on. These are the things I'm working towards next. And that was also tied into my students led their own conferences. And to really lead their own conferences, they had to know what they were working on and be able to articulate that and set some goals and talk about how they were going to do those things. So with those kids, I probably would have included a transcript, but I might also have some of those student work samples maybe in a pictures that were shrink down or something. I hope that answers some of these questions.
All right, let's go on to the next slide. Please read that article because it really does have some good information. And then let's look at the next slide. You know, the architecture of accomplished teaching is another one of our foundational documents. I don't know how much you've looked at that, but it is, we consider the standards, the 5 core propositions, and this architecture of accomplished teaching kind of the foundation of all learning for National Board. So these things need to be integrated into your component, all of the components. So you can really see how this architecture of accomplished teaching is an important part of component 4. So first of all, let's just take a look at the architecture, and then we can talk about how it kind of jives with this component, and it goes along with the formative, summative, and self-assessment parts of this component. So in the architecture of accomplished teaching, you can see this double helix. And here at the very first step is kind of knowing your students. Who are they? Where are they? Like, what do they need? So you can see how that is really a part of what you've already been doing with your group profile and getting to know your students. It's also connected to the 5 core propositions in teachers are committed to students and their learning. So you can start to see how all of these things really go together. So after you know who your students are, then you are setting high, worthwhile goals appropriate for these students at this time in this setting. And you know, this other side of the helix, I think it doesn't actually say it on here, but it kind of represents your student. And that's where the whole self-assessment is coming into play, because they need to be on this journey with you. When you're setting high goals for your students, they need to know what they are too. And that's where those, learning targets and all of those kinds of things come into play. Your students need to know what's going on too. So as you set these high worthwhile goals, then you're implementing your instruction. So that is part of this component also, is that whole unit kind of plan and the goals that you're making for them. And again, your students are on this journey too. I mean, they need to be with you, not being, dragged along. So they need to know what the goals are and what, they need to be part, of course, they're part of that instruction too. So then you're evaluating your students in light of the goals. So all along here, I would say, is your formative assessments. You are, as you're going along in the unit, you need to know how they're doing throughout. So you're doing these formative assessments to see if they're meeting these targets that you're setting for them, and so that they can see if they're meeting those targets. And then you're setting new goals after you've kind of, you know, you're using those assessments to see if they're meeting these goals along the way. Setting new goals, you know, you're reflecting and then setting new goals. So this helix is kind of the DNA of teaching, and you can see how all of those 5 core propositions are kind of interwoven throughout there. Now, in the article, it gave 3 questions. It says that students should be able to answer 3 basic questions. So, where am I going? Where am I now? And how can I close the gap? And to me, those questions are exactly what this architecture of accomplished teaching is talking about. So the students need to be able to answer, where am I going? And so through those formative assessments, they can say, where am I now? And then if they know the goals, they can help figure out what they need to do to close the gap between what they know now and what they need to know. So there are some examples also in the article that might be helpful to you on some different kinds of formative assessments and some different ways that they can, you know, exit slips and reflections. And there is even like a student self-assessment form. You know, these are just samples. There are lots of different ideas for that. And if you've got something you want to share, feel free to either grab the mic or put that in the chat box.
We're having a conversation here in the chat box related to this idea of multiple choice assessments for summative, which Kevin brought up specifically as an art teacher. But one of the comments I made, from my perspective, I think it's really hard to know what kids know sometimes through multiple choice assessment. And to really, I would encourage everybody to consider summative assessments that allow for some more open-ended answers through maybe performances or presentations or conversations or some writing, and really to think about that. That just because it's summative doesn't mean it needs to be a multiple choice. I know, of course, in Kentucky, you know, that a lot of us, when we think of summative assessment, are thinking maybe about a district-wide, district-created common assessment or K-prep or MAP or things like that. But this is not, it doesn't have to be that. Think about just, you want to really make sure that the assessment that you're giving, whether it's one you create or one that's copyrighted, is truly an assessment that's going to measure exactly what your target is. And I think sometimes that can be really hard to do with a multiple choice or even with a copyrighted assessment. Something else that came up in our conversation with National Board, they were really cautioning about how you cannot submit anything that's copyrighted. So if you do something that's copyrighted, you're going to have to just describe it. So if it were me, I wouldn't use copyrighted. I just think it's really going to limit your ability to show that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, you could have a combination of some multiple choice questions and some more open-ended kinds of questions in your summative assessment. But it's those open-ended things that are really going to give you more things to reflect on and to talk about.
And I love Holly using this analogy that your students are the ones that are expected to answer these questions. So when you look at the architecture and the description, this graphic lives in the front of everyone's standards document. So in your standards document, it does have a graphic with this and not a lot of words around how to use the architecture, other than that it says the double helix is one is for the teacher and one is for the student, and those things should be tightly wound between your instruction and what you're seeing with your students. However, with this conversation, and what Holly's pointing out too, is that if you're really effective at this idea of self-assessment and your students are really self-aware, then they should be able to follow the path through this architecture on their own and really thinking about their own instruction and their own needs and their own goals for themselves. Sorry, my screen is frozen. That took a minute to switch. Yeah, it jumped. Sorry. It wouldn't go and then it went too far. So sorry, next slide.
The other thing that I just wanted to point out quickly, because I want us to have time to finish up everything that we wanted to talk about today, was just, you know, in Kentucky, we are pretty familiar with Danielson's framework. And there are some nice things in there about it. The Danielson framework, the 3D, using assessment in instruction. There are some assessment criteria. It talks about monitoring of student learning, feedback, and student self-assessment and monitoring of progress. And remember, in Danielson, it talks about, you know, look at the accomplished and exemplary cells, but don't forget there are even some examples in that document. So that might be a really good place. It lists critical attributes and then possible examples. So if you're still in your planning, you know, stages and just looking for ideas of how to do this, the assessment part, pull out Danielson and look there at some of the possible examples. You might get some ideas. Then working with setting up your student group, there in your directions, it talks about using your entire class to develop your profile. And if you teach a whole group, then you need to use your whole group. Like I said earlier, this component is kind of focused on working with your group of students rather than individual students. So your entire class is what you'll use for your profile. I know I've had some people ask me if they could use their small guided reading group, those kinds of things. And the answer is no. I mean, not if you are, like if I'm a third grade teacher and I pull groups back to a table for guided reading, I cannot choose one of those small groups that I pull back to my table. My group profile needs to be on my whole group. Now, if you're a reading recovery teacher and your job is to work with individual students, your group can, like when I was reading recovery, I taught 4 reading recovery students each day. So those 4 students I could pull together as my group. But that's only if I don't have a whole group. So I know there may be some questions about that, and if we don't address individuals in this, I can follow up with you and we can kind of try to figure that out for you. So,
I think Elizabeth's example, I've got a question. So Elizabeth, when you say that you're focusing on your reading class and it doesn't include the students who have reading resource, I'm assuming that you are departmentalized for reading. Because the students that are in reading resource are still your students. So you really need to be careful about who is on your roster as a student, and those students all need to be included in your group profile. Or if you're just rostered, okay, so you still need to include them, from what I understand, in your group profile, because even though you don't teach them reading, you collaborate with the person who does, and they are still your kids. So you would need to include their information in the group profile. That doesn't mean that those are the kids that you're going to identify in the student need that you decide to address. But that their data and their information, their assessment information, you do need to discuss them in your group profile. Holly, was that how you interpret that too?
Well, I think that's something we might could try to follow up with some more information, because like I know in my setting, I'm a librarian, but I teach a reading group that is my reading group. And it's 25 students, and it's like that's my first period that's assigned to me. So I'm the teacher of record for their first period class, which it's a group of 25 students. So I would think if I were doing this component, I could use that reading group as my group. What do you think?
I don't know. I would just be really careful, because they emphasized this a whole lot on the call that we had with them, that they made it sound like if you're a classroom teacher, let's say like third grade or fourth grade, or that you make sure that you include all of the students from your class in your profile, even if you're not necessarily the one to give them that instruction, is kind of how I heard it. I feel like the exceptions to this are people that maybe are, let's say, an art teacher. Like I know some of the specials teachers like Holly and the librarians are talking about how they have like 300 to 600 kids a day. You obviously are not going to do a profile on all of those kids. And then there were some examples given on the call for like special education teachers, and that kind of information, as Holly talked about, would apply to interventionists that pull small groups, and really looking at maybe a trend for if I'm pulling small groups, maybe I'm going to just focus on for my classroom, for my profile, I might just choose one grade level or one of those. If it's a large group of kids, like Holly's describing 25 kids, that's a whole group of kids that could be described. Or if I'm a math interventionist and I pull lots of small groups, maybe I'm going to include the data for my first grade students in my profile or something. But this might be another place where it's, when you get this specific, you may just want to reach out to that number to make sure that you're doing the right thing. This to me felt like a very important thing to be clear on.
Right. I agree. And like Elizabeth has said something about if it's on your contextual information sheet, then I think that is if it's listed in your contextual information, then those kids need to be in the group profile.
And that doesn't mean, Elizabeth, that like, because when you have your group profile, that's where you're really looking at data of this class, your class. And the fact that you have some students who are, let's say, non-readers, and they're not with you during reading instruction, you're going to, after you have your larger group, that's when you determine a need. And that need may only be for some of your students. And the need that you're going to specifically address is not the need of the kids that are pulled by this special ed teacher, it sounds like. It sounds like right. You're focusing on the need of the instruction you're implementing for a small group of kids, or that group of students that you do serve. I think it's important to talk about how the needs of these other students, if there's even room for it, just because you're not choosing these students, it doesn't mean that their needs aren't being met somehow. You're not going to have every student in perhaps your student need group. The student need might be a need for a part of the students you instruct.
Right. You're meeting their needs through some special tiered intervention that they're having during that time.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be the need you choose to write about, does not have to be necessarily the need of every kid in that whole group, because we've talked about that that's one of those balances where you have tension as a teacher.
So I don't think there would be anything wrong with including those kids in your profile for you. I mean, just do it and say, because of their need, they are, being met in a smaller group setting, they're doing this. And so then what are you doing with the rest of them? I mean, I think that's actually good.
Right. And that it doesn't have to be something that you write about, obviously, depending on your space and your priorities, but you could highlight how you collaborate to meet their needs too, as a possible example. Are there other questions or comments around this idea of the groups?
And don't hesitate to reach out to 222 Teach. I mean, that, if you would like, a definitive answer, I mean, that's what I would do. So under student need, there's like, for the assessment and instructional unit, you have your students from this year. And that's, that's where you're building your profile and all of that. But when you get to the portion of for your professional need, it can be based on those same students, or it could even include students from last year. So it may be that your student need is something that you've seen a trend over time. It does not have to be specifically from the students that you are teaching right now. That's something that I had kind of had a question about, and that was something they addressed in that webinar. It seems to me that it would be logical that it's kind of nice and tight, but it doesn't have to be. So I think you will want, you'll have to show some kind of evidence for impact on student learning. So think in terms of that when you're thinking about your professional need too. But it can be something that is a trend that you've seen over time. And we will talk a little bit about that when we give some scenarios that I think might help at least give you an idea what we're talking about. So you always want to start with that student need, because you do have to connect impact on student learning. So the impact on student learning is connected to the need that you have.
So, Amanda, I think that's a really good question. The way that I understand this in some of the conversations I've had with National Board is that, so there's two big buckets here. There's the student need that's driving the instructional unit that is coming from your assessment analysis and things. But then there's also this whole idea of a professional need. And the professional need is still going to somehow be related to something that you need to do because of a student need. So for example, it may be that, and I think the scenarios that Holly's talking about will help address this, but it might be that in talking with your students or in really looking at some of the assessment data, you realize that your kids are struggling with maybe explaining their answers. So because of that, you decide, I need to know better how to teach that way. I need to learn more about how to make it so my students can explain their answers better. So the thing that this component is really different from than in the past, the really big thing, the one thing that is different about what you all are demonstrating in your component for and what Holly and I had to demonstrate in our entry for, is that what they're saying with this component is that everything starts, whether it's instruction or your leadership or your professionalism, all of that should really start with student need. You can't just say, I want to learn more about this thing because it seems cool. So and I'm going to prove that, I'm going to go out and learn that and then show how that impacts my kids. What they're saying is, before you decide to collaborate or learn more or lead, you need to figure out, you need to listen to what your kids need and have that be what drives your professional need, and then show how that impacts kids. And I'm pretty sure that you probably actually already have that's probably what is driving your professional need, but you do need to just make certain that you can link that to a student need and then show the student impact.
What I have underlined in the directions that I'm looking at, it says, while the professional or student needs may be directly related to the subject you teach, you may include needs from the broader learning community as long as addressing those needs is clearly connected to student learning in your practice. Include ways in which this participation impacts your practice of gathering and using information about students to inform your instructional and assessment practices and contribute to positive learning changes for students. So I think it is, you know, if it's connected to student learning, I think that's going to, you're going to be able to show it better if it's a student need. Does that make sense? I mean, I think it's got to address the student needs to more clearly show impact on student learning.
Right. And one of the examples that they gave on this webinar that we just attended was it might be something that you really notice as a school. Like it might be that you're noticing some behavior things or some bullying or something like that, and that it doesn't really relate as much to what you're directly seeing every day in your classroom for your content area, but maybe it's things you notice on the playground or in the lunchroom or in transition, or that you're really feeling as a priority to make your school feel safe or to have so these are two different needs. So for example, the need that you're addressing in your unit of instruction is one need, but it could be a very different thing that's driving it doesn't have to be the same thing that's driving your professional learning too.
Right.
That those can be separate. So it might be that, like, for my student need, maybe I'm really working on I need an example. I'm drawing a blank. So I know we've got some active chat box with art teachers. So it might be that there's something related to a component in art. So so maybe that's the focus of my self-assessment and my instructional unit and my need. But maybe my professional need is very much about like a social skill or something that I'm really trying to address in my classroom. Or maybe it's that I know that I'm working with a lot of kids that are coming from some pretty difficult home situations. And maybe my professional need is I want to learn more about how to help those kids. It could be totally different. It could be, yes, it can be absolutely, Amanda. So Amanda, your example I think is really nice. So it talks about like, for instance, I don't always feel that I successfully tap into the creative potential of the growing number of students with profound disabilities who are in my art classes. Can you address that? Yes. And that is, even though it may not be at all what you're addressing in your instructional piece with your other student need, this is something that you're noticing, and you're noticing that based on that is a need of your students. So you have these kids with profound disabilities and you feel like they're not demonstrating a certain level of creativity or their potential. That's something you're noticing based on the analysis of these kids. So even though maybe these kids aren't saying, you're not tapping into my creative potential, that's something that you see as a student need for these kids and that you really want to address that and work on that as a potential. So that could be something that you would set as your professional need. And Jennifer, I hope that clarifies what your question was.
And I think she articulated it very well, that it should be driven by student need, but not necessarily the same need.
Exactly. And I think part of what this also, what I appreciate is that you all are giving some examples that really, to do this well, you're going to have to name and claim some areas that you need to grow. You have to really be pretty vulnerable to say, I feel like I'm not doing a good enough job of this. And that's exactly what you need to do to grow in this component area. There's all things that we feel like we could be doing better. So at Cecil, I think that that's also something that you could work on, would be something with student engagement, having your students teaching them how to answer more clarifying questions, ask more clarifying questions, or how to be more advocates, that also, like this whole piece of student voice and student engagement could be what you're focusing on too. So these are some good examples. And I think that I'm hopeful that in some of these scenarios that we're going to talk about, that will also help.
But it sounds like you all are getting a good handle on it.
I think so too. So this is an example actually from my own experience. And this was at a time when I was working as a math intervention teacher in an elementary school. This school was a K-5 building, and my job was to work with the struggling learners in math that were not already on a special education caseload, so people who were not receiving other services, but needed some help in order to be successful in the math classrooms. And because I was a math specialist, I was often called in to help with like a data analysis day. And I was collaborating with a 5th grade teacher and looking at her data. And we were really, part of that conversation was really just to make sure that my caseload didn't need to change, and how were the kids that were in intervention services doing. And that was really why I was in the room. However, through that conversation, this 5th grade teacher said, you know, this is really weird. I'm noticing that when I look at their K-Prep data and their MAP data and all of these types of assessments, and then I look and see how these kids are performing in the class, I see a real discrepancy. She said, I've got these girls. I'm surprised to see that there's this group of 5 or 6 girls who are scoring the highest in 5th grade, because these kids are not participating in class. They're not raising their hand. They're not leaders in my classroom, and they're not doing as well on my classroom assessments and in my observations as this group of boys. And she said, I'm really surprised to see that these girls are so strong in math. We had a long conversation around that, and a lot about gender and STEM, and about some stereotypes. So this was several years back, before Hidden Figures, and before a lot of these initiatives to get girls more involved in STEM. And really thinking about, so the question that really drove our thinking was, what are we not doing for these girls? Why is this happening? Why is there this discrepancy between what she's seeing in the classroom and what these other assessments are telling her about these girls? And I'm going to pause for a minute, because you guys have done such a really good job of thinking about some ideas, and give you an opportunity to think about what we could do for these kids. And I can share a little bit about what we did, and maybe that can also give you some ideas too. And feel free to grab the microphone if you want to talk instead of type. That's a really interesting solution, Lee. Ellen. We did not, but that is another way that we could address this. So we did kind of do something that was specific for these girls. We did kind of create a club, but I think, Holly, we did do some of those things too, in terms of examples of women in roles. What was interesting was the teacher was a woman too. So it wasn't as if this was a male-dominated example that they were looking at in daily for their instruction. But we did create, we weren't able to gender, we weren't able to segregate by gender the classes. That was something that I guess we could have tried to consider, but it was going to be really messy given the way that this grade was departmentalizing. But what we did was we decided to create a club that was completely optional for these girls to meet after school once a week. And what I was noticing as a math interventionist was that this was right around when we just started doing the new mathematical standards. And I, to be honest, had a lot of teachers that were really struggling with how to teach fractions to be in line with the new standards. I had a lot of teachers that were uncomfortable with some of the strategies that they were expected to demonstrate for their students, and everything felt pretty foreign to them. So one of the things that we did was we reached out to these girls and asked them for help. And we said, we wanted to create this math leadership club. And it was an invitation only. I was a little concerned, to be honest, that I was going to get in trouble for only having girls. So I got it cleared with our central office to make sure that wasn't discriminatory. And they were fine with that. And then these girls would meet after school, and the teachers in the building would create, one of the things they did was the teachers could say that they really wanted these girls to come up with a game or a lesson to help to teach something like partial products or partial quotients, or lots of different strategies that these teachers were not completely familiar with. And the ways that they did that was we made it safe by saying that we know that your kids are going to think it's really neat if these fifth grade girls are the ones that are teaching these lessons or creating these games. And not to say that, that they wanted help with those strategies, but maybe by having the students do it, then it would, that the younger students who were listening to this instruction or using these games would actually engage better because it was student-led learning. So that was how we kind of started it. And they actually created a lot of videos and demonstrations and used apps because I wasn't able to pull them out of the classroom to go and teach those lessons in person. So we used a lot of technology to help with that. They decided to do some family game nights, and they came up with all of the games, created everything. They led every single one of the centers that had those games school-wide for several days. They also were really interested in knowing more about careers in STEM. And we Skyped with women engineers. We Skyped with the Gatton Academy and talked with young women that were going to the Gatton Academy at Western Kentucky University, which has a STEM focus. And they were really excited. The Gatton Academy sent them STEM t-shirts. And to be honest, the impact on these girls was huge. She immediately saw a difference in their classrooms, but what these parents were telling me was that these were kids that would come home and say they hated math and science and STEM. And we even had a STEM lab at our school, and we noticed it in the STEM lab too. But then these girls still to this day, they're now in high school, and they want to be engineers. They want to be mathematicians. They think these things are super cool now. So really just looking at how this, even though these students, we wanted to highlight this example because student learning need doesn't necessarily mean that these have to be struggling students. These were students that were underperforming or their needs weren't being met, but they were very high students. They were the highest students in the school. So to think a little differently about that. I had to learn a lot also professionally about how to meet the needs of gifted students because that wasn't the population that I worked with. I had to collaborate a lot with the community, with the STEM lab in our school, with the math teachers, with the teachers that were asking for instruction for things for their students, and then also for with families. So this is just one example. Holly, you want to talk about this one?
Yes. All right. This scenario is kind of based on something I did a couple of years ago, and it was literacy in African American boys. And we were looking at data and just thinking about trends. I mean, I know as I was a third grade teacher, and for the last few years, we had just kind of noticed that some of our boys were just starting to kind of, pull away from being interested in the things that we were suggesting for reading, and just that whole excitement that seemed to be there about reading was kind of shifting in about third grade for some of our boys. And it really jived with what we were seeing data-wise too. And so we were looking at how those two things kind of went together. And we had a real gap between our African American boys and our other boy population. And so we started thinking, what we're missing something for these kids. What are we not doing? And I think that was an important question for us, because it wasn't what they're not doing, and it wasn't what their families weren't doing. It's what were we not doing? And I think that's the place where you can actually learn something, is when you're not trying to blame someone else, but you're owning the problem yourself. So we started thinking about it. And one thing that we did was we made like kind of a little committee, and it was just people that were interested in this. And I wasn't doing this for national board or for anything. It was just, we were concerned. So we've had a little literacy committee that we just kind of made, and started thinking about how can we address this need and how can we learn more. So one of the first things we did was a stakeholder meeting, and we brought in people from our African American community, because we lack diversity in our teaching force at our school. It's something that we need to work on and be more deliberate about. And so we brought in just some key stakeholders, because we have, our police chief, our public library director. We have a lot of African American people that are in key positions in our city. And so we brought those people in, but we also brought in just a wide range of people. And they came to my house. We had a dinner, and it was very informal, and just asked them to talk to us about how we can be better teachers for children of color in our school. So some of it was hard to hear, but it was all really, really important. And so we took that information, and we made kind of an action plan, and did some real strategic things to try to meet those needs, tried to make sure we hit things that they mentioned specifically, so they could see that we really were serious and weren't just paying lip service, but really wanted to try to do some of the things that they suggested. And so then we did that, and kind of tried to follow the data for a year to see if the things that we were doing were making an impact. So that was a professional need that was identified. And then we were doing lots of research. We brought in a person from our local university that gave us some strategies that were supposed to be really beneficial for boys in particular. And just a lot of different things, a lot of different learning that happened, along with then trying to monitor if it was having impact. So that's the kind of thing that this whole professional need and learning is about, I think, is seeing a way that you can improve your practice, and then how that learning and that systematic implementation impacts student learning in your school. And yeah, that Suzanne, the community part of that was really important. And, we developed a whole mentoring program as a result of that, something that is still in place now that we're still seeing some really nice benefits from. And it's all that whole community, the university, and asking the students themselves. And something else that we started doing was like a little book club of just these boys that we felt like that needed to bridge that gap and push them up academically. And so we started a little book club just for them, and they were picking their own books and having people that led those book clubs and things like that they really identified with. We started noticing we did just a cultural relevancy, cultural pedagogy kind of inventory in our school, looking to see like our bulletin boards. Are all the children in our school represented on those, in our displays, in our boards, like the pictures of children that they see in our books and on our shelves and on our bulletin boards? Does everybody see themselves somewhere? We just really tried to make it a priority in our school for everyone to be able to see themselves in the things that we were highlighting. So maybe something like that. I mean, that was a huge kind of thing. Yours doesn't have to be huge, but maybe that kind of spurs some ideas for you if you're still looking for some ideas.
Yeah, they don't all have to be big projects. And I think like the first two examples are much more that we've given are a little more about things that you might be taking on outside of your classroom or that are bigger than your classroom. This next scenario, this is the last one that we're going to highlight. This was actually one from my class when I was a preschool teacher several years ago. So this would have been, I'd say, more than 12 years ago, that I had a student that had severe autism, and she was nonverbal. And she could make noises when she was excited or upset or happy or hungry or hurt, or when she wanted something, but she hadn't learned any sign language yet, but she was learning to sign words like more, yes, no, want, in, eat, bathroom, play, hurt, done, things like that. The other students I had in my class were all verbal and were really curious about her and wanted to know more about why she couldn't talk, and why she was learning sign language, and why she made those sounds and what that meant. And to be honest, I was doing my best to answer those questions, but they're hard questions to answer. And I didn't know a lot of sign language myself. So the students were super interested in learning sign language so that they could communicate with her, and also figuring out ways for them to communicate with her, and they wanted to understand her more. So really this was a lot about a need for my classroom to feel more like a community. And my kids really had a need of trying to understand and relate more to this student who in many ways could be really disruptive to the class, because of she at that age would just dump things off the shelves and make loud noises, and really wanting to know, as you can imagine, children being really curious, really wanting to know how to help her and how to be her friend, and what was going on in her head because she couldn't talk to them. So at that point, I really felt like this is something that was a need of me professionally, that my kids were telling me these things. I could see that this would help this student in particular with autism, but also all of the other kids in the class to get along better if we could really address this need, and that I needed to grow professionally and to learn more about how to do that. So I reached out to people who I felt like could be experts for me, including our speech language pathologist, who was helping us with this communication plan and was more expert in understanding students with severe disabilities. Also reached out to we had the mother of this child come to class and talk about the things that she could see this student at home, what she really liked and what she was like, and the things that what she wanted for her daughter, and the history of her autism, and knowing a little bit more about her and being able to ask questions about her to her mom was really important to them. We also had a paraprofessional who taught across the hall from me, who was fluent in sign language, but she didn't really use sign a lot at school, but fluent in sign language because she was the child of deaf adults. So she was raised by two deaf parents, and she really taught us a lot of sign language, but also talked a lot about, they were curious about the deaf community, even though this child was not deaf, and wanting to know more about how sign language worked and some of the rules around ASL. And they were really curious to know actually how this student learned to speak and understand, how this teacher learned how to speak and understand oral communication, even though her parents didn't know it. And so it was really interesting for them to kind of go down this path. And they really got excited about, and that was, to be honest, I think that owning this and saying that I needed help and really talking openly about the students' needs and really trying to embrace that as a classroom changed the entire classroom community that I had with this student. So this was the first year I had her, and I got her when she was about 2.5. And then I had her for 4 years. And when she left, she was communicating really well with everyone in our class, even though she still was nonverbal 4 years later. But it made a huge difference. It made a difference for our students to understand her and to have some empathy for her frustration, for what it would be like to not be able to communicate with peers. She really created some friendships, some genuine friendships. So it doesn't have to be like an academic need. Even though communication can hit academics, what was really driving this need was that we needed to improve our community. All right. Something else that's important for you to notice in your instructions, at the very end, people often overlook, after all of the forms, there are scoring rubrics for every component. And a 4 for every certificate area, and for every one of these these are the same. The list of things for all 4 levels of the rubric are the same. The only difference is, to get a 4, you have to provide clear, consistent, and convincing evidence of these things. A 3 is clear evidence. And a 3 would demonstrate accomplished. A 2 is limited evidence. So if you have limited evidence, you know that you're not getting a 3. So really thinking about, when you look at this list, being sure that you have at least clear evidence, if not clear, consistent, and convincing evidence of all of these things. So we're going to aim for a 4 for each one of these bullet points. These bullet points were, there were a couple of certificate areas where we noticed that some of these bullet points were a little bit different, but these are the big ideas that seem to be consistent across most certificate areas.
I really love looking at the scoring rubrics, because to me it really punches the important parts. Like, you know what they're really looking for. So you can go back and really make sure in your directions that you pay attention to those things.
Sorry, I was frozen again.
And something in the chat box about, using, it says, participation impacts your practice of gathering and using information about students to inform your instructional and assessment practices. I thought we were supposed to use the data to help us know our need and not vice versa. But like on the rubric, it talked about assessments being recursive. So that might be a way to kind of think about that. Like if you're like, everything is kind of recursive in assessment. So you're learning more and it's impacting, and then you're finding out more. So I think maybe in terms of that when you're looking at that part. And we can talk more about that. All right.
We are going to send everybody the recording, even those of you that are on. So, because it's just easier to send it to everyone who's registered. So if you decide you want to listen to it again or anything, you can if you want to, but that recording is really intentionally for people that are unable to attend. However, Holly is going to also be creating a survey for feedback. Yes. And Holly, you want to talk about that a minute?
Well, after we get finished here, I'll make a little survey. We just want to know if this was helpful to you. What parts you still are, like where else do you need information? Like, well, how else can we help you? And I'll send that out, and then just reply to that so that we can then kind of make our next steps. We need the data from you so we can then kind of figure out how to best help you.
Right. So that could be maybe we could even add a webinar perhaps if there's a really strong trend for a specific piece that you want help with, or it might be things that Holly can address more individually. Yes. If there's very specific small questions. And we also, you may have already noticed, but we have other webinars already scheduled for all of the other components. This is our first one. And there's one that's also just addressed to some writing tips that's going to be in April that I think you all will find really helpful to, even if you haven't written, to help you at that point to get started and to really think about your writing. And if you've already written, some thoughts on your revision. And also, you probably won't need this, but we also have a page that's on the same website, it's in a very close place. Actually, it's under the same heading of candidate support. We have our getting started videos, and we also have these webinars there. So we'll put the recorded webinars on that same page where you registered, but that took you to Eventbrite. But then we also have some short getting started videos that talk about things like some very basic things in terms of even where to find the directions and how to read your standards, and questions that people have about the stipend and things like that. So if there's ideas that you have for future videos, you can also let us know and we can create some more there too.
And I just put my email in the chat box. It's holly.bloodworth@murray.schools.us. So feel free to email me questions. And I know Suzanne is really busy right now, so maybe email me first. And if I don't know the answer, I will definitely confer with her and try to follow up with you as quickly as possible.
That would be great. Thank you, Holly. So there were some questions from the chat box that I want to make sure that we've answered. And if you have questions that you still have that we haven't addressed, we do have a little bit of time. Some of those may have to end up being addressed through the survey or through emailing Holly because of the time that we're at. But want to make sure that I know there was a question around best ways to get to know your students effectively when you see approximately 600 students for an hour a week. And I know that there were some comments for the chat box. If that's something you still want to talk about, let us know. There was also one around I think this has been answered, but does it say somewhere what subject this component has to be in? It doesn't address a subject in terms of, it's not like if you're a generalist, it's not like this. I know some of those generalist certificate components tell you what subject it has to be. This one does not. There was a question around student growth goals for PGS. What are your thoughts on a student growth goal from PGS? And that could be something that you include as another part of your evidence. I wouldn't limit your assessment to one assessment in particular. I think that the idea around this component is really looking at multiple forms of assessment, which you'll see as a common thread when you look at the Green Book.
Someone just asked about format for lesson plans and that kind of thing. There's not. You answer the questions and you follow the formatting directions in your directions. It gives real specific directions about font size and those kinds of things. But I think when you're really talking about your unit and things, it's more just answering the questions. And then someone asked about good ways to connect with PLCs in relation to their professional learning need. You're not limited to your school on that, although you'll be, you want to connect with your community and your colleagues and all, but you could also reach out to other professional, learning communities online and those kinds of things and bring back information to your school.
And, if you're looking at something that's pretty content specific and maybe you're the only person in your building that's in that content area or with that interest, that of course would be a time to start looking and asking around with your colleagues that have your expertise in other schools. But it might be that this is something that you are having a hard time finding and you might have to initiate. So if you really want to learn more about a certain thing, and you might have to research it a little bit and ask your colleagues what they know or who's interested in learning more about that. It could be that you're really driving that as an individual need and then collaborating with other people as you see appropriate. So for me, I didn't know anything about what my student needed, but I had to reached out to the people in my building that I thought could help me and her mom. And really I was there primarily as a learner. But if I hadn't collaborated with those people, I would not have learned. And it wasn't really necessarily a formal PLC. It was just a matter of me trying to help get my professional needs met. But it did also then drive some conversations with my colleagues, like my speech language pathologist and other teachers in the building that had students with autism.
And when I did the literacy thing at my school, I just sent out an email and just asked if anyone was interested in working with me on, some ideas around, and kind of listed some things I wanted to think about. And I had 12 people show up. So you might be surprised. Other people may have the same interest and needs and concerns.
No, it doesn't have to be a formal PLC. You can think of that as any kind of
learning community.
Professional learning. Right. And sometimes, you have to get creative to really address the needs that you have. It looks like from the chat box that we've covered everything that I'd pulled out.
If we did not, please feel free to email me after this or put it on the survey that I'll send.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording.